Hello, modern era wargamers everywhere. This is Oriskany, welcoming you to another episode of the Op Center, part of the expanding content rolling out for the SITREP channel on Podbean, YouTube, on tabletop.com, iTunes, and other platforms. As part of our 4-part video series on the Arab-Israeli Wars, our last episode looked at Operation Kadesh and the Sinai War of 1956, fought between Egypt and Israel, linked in the description below. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, I highly recommend you give it a skim, since today's video will naturally build on what was presented before. But for now, let's push forward, looking at the next chapter in the ongoing Arab-Israeli conflict, the Six-Day War of 1967. The Six-Day War was fought between June 5th and 10th, 1967, primarily between the forces of Israel on the one side, and Egypt, then Jordan, and finally Syria on the other. I say first because, by and large, Israel didn't have to fight all of these enemies at once, the war instead rolling out in a series of phases. I also say primarily because there were other constituent units of other armies that were involved on the Arab side. So I won't get stuck too deeply into the geopolitics on this one. If you've seen our previous episode, you know how the Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had tried to establish himself as the leader of a pan-Arab coalition, not necessarily aligned with either the East or the West. However, the disastrous result of the 1956 war, and the US more or less replacing the British and French as the major supporting state of Israel, increasingly hedged Egypt more and more firmly into the Soviet camp during the 1960s. By 1967, the Soviets were hoping to capitalize on their new leverage in the Middle East, especially with the United States so critically mired at the time in the Vietnam War. Again, I won't get into all the details here, but suffice it to say that in summary, what the Soviets did was plant a false report through the Egyptian Foreign Ministry that the Israelis were mobilizing an invasion of the Golan Heights along their border with Syria. Now, while patently false, this idea wasn't really unthinkable. There were many artillery and rocket attacks into Galilee from Syrian positions along the Golan Heights, and the Syrians had taken to cutting off irrigation to Israeli agricultural settlements in what was being called the Water War. So Nasser responded. He demanded that the United Nations pull out of the Sinai, which peacekeepers had occupied since the War of '56. His army reoccupied the Sinai, and from the peninsula's southern tip, he closed the Straits of Tiran. Now, this is an important waterway. It's the only Israeli shipping passage to the Eastern world. He also staged mobilizations, weapons tests, military parades, made belligerent speeches, all again to prop up his imagined and since 1956 somewhat damaged position as the strongman of the Arab world. Egypt also began applying pressure on other Arab states to help. When the King of Jordan visited Cairo to review the situation, Nasser is reported to casually remark, "What if we just shot you and said that you never arrived?" A few minutes later, Jordan was predictably signed up in a potential war against Israel. Israel, meanwhile, wrangled over what to do. Levi Eshkol, the Israeli prime minister, wanted peace and international support. His generals, on the other hand, wanted a preemptive strike against Israel's tightening circle of enemies. The Americans, who were now Israel's primary ally, vowed to support the Israelis if attacked. But if Israel struck first, the Americans would turn their backs. Eshkol was thus left with a cruel dilemma, whether to sacrifice the vital military advantage of a first strike or any hope of critically needed international support. Meanwhile, the Russians were telling Nasser pretty much the same thing. Don't hit the Israelis first, or say goodbye to Soviet support. Meanwhile, however, Nasser's allies and his own populace had been whipped up into such a war fury that Nasser himself frankly couldn't control. If he backed down now, he'd look like a fool, or worse, a coward. Both sides were also up against the clock. Israel by now had fully mobilized, calling into service every man between the ages of 18 and 55, and requisitioning virtually every vehicle in the country. This halts the Israeli economy dead in its tracks, something that the country can't do for more than a few weeks. Meanwhile, more Egyptian troops poured into the Sinai every day. The Soviets had staged groups of strike fighters in the Caucasus, being ominously repainted in Egyptian markings. With each passing hour, the Israelis were pushed into a choice ever more stark. Strike now, or await invasion. The Egyptians, for their part, were also running out of time. Arab populations were screaming for Nasser to make good on his threats. Then the Soviets abruptly about-faced, telling the Egyptians to go ahead and strike first if they wanted. The CIA station chief in Israel at the time likened the Egyptians to a belligerent boy being held back by his father, yelling to be let loose and swinging fists at a stronger schoolmate. Then the father suddenly shrugs and lets go. No matter. By June 5th, 1967, the Israelis had made up their mind, and the Six-Day War was on. The key question here is, was Israel really in danger in the summer of 1967? Even the very names of today's war games, like Fate of a Nation, were given the impression that Israel was fighting for her life. At face value, this is just absurd. The CIA and Pentagon analysts in 1967 unanimously predicted complete Israeli victory in any war within 7 days if they struck first. Within 10 to 14 days, if Egypt, Jordan, and Syria all struck first and all struck together. A big part of the Egyptian army, about 60,000 troops, were in fact bogged down in Yemen, part of a civil war that was raging there at the time. The Egyptian army in the Sinai was clearly deployed for defense, in deeply entrenched positions, infantry divisions in front, and armored divisions in back in a second echelon. You do not set up your army this way if you're about to invade somebody. The Arab states were definitely not united. Nasser had to threaten King Hussein's life just to get Jordan's involvement. Egyptian generals are on record as knowing full well at the time that they stood no chance whatsoever against the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF. All this said, Israel was beset by enemies nevertheless. Even if her army and air force would win any potential war in the open, the Egyptians had sealed the Straits of Tiran, utterly crippling Israel's small economy. Syrian interference with agriculture in the Galilee put a huge strain on the country's ability to feed itself. These northern areas of the Galilee are really the only place where Israel can grow a large amount of food. Meanwhile, paramilitary raids, artillery barrages, and rocket strikes were coming in from all three directions all the time. That's Israel, Jordan, and Syria. Egyptian warplanes had overflown the Israeli city of Dimona. So while the IDF would admittedly win in any open battle, Israel herself was under threat nonetheless. Powerful as the IDF may have been, even they couldn't simultaneously hit all three armies threatening their borders all at once. They therefore resolved to hit Egypt first, far and away the largest and most direct threat. It was hoped that a decisive strike here would compel Jordan and Syria to stand down, perhaps forestalling the necessity of war with these states at all. The Israeli onslaught would begin with Operation Moked, or Focus. Planned by Air Force Commander Major General Mordecai Hod and IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Yitzhak Rabin, this was a series of surprise Israeli airstrikes designed to hit Egyptian airfields, communication lines, and command centers early on the morning of June 5th, 1967. Israeli intelligence for this strike was painstakingly detailed, down to the time most enemy air units would be finishing dawn patrols and starting their morning shift. Months of training and briefings had ensured that Israeli pilots knew every inch of their targets. Ground crews were drilled to turn aircraft around for another strike in just 7 minutes. Surprise was total, and the effect was devastating. The first strikes included special ordnance designed specifically to wreck the runways so enemy aircraft on the ground couldn't take off. The handful of Arab aircraft that managed to get into the sky were now terribly outnumbered and were swept away by Israeli fighters already waiting for them. As Egypt's air force was being annihilated, Israel warned Jordan to stay out of it on the morning of June 5th, promising to respect her neutrality if she just stayed in her chair, so to speak. But by 10 a.m. that morning, Jordanian artillery was shelling neighborhoods in the Israeli sectors of Jerusalem, and localized assaults on key buildings had already begun. By midday, the Israeli Air Force therefore turned on Jordan as well, leaving its air force and command structure in smoking ruins. And while they were at it, they took care of the Syrians as well. By nightfall on the first day of the war, Israel owned the skies over the entire region. Even as these lightning airstrikes were in progress, the IDF was in action on the ground. Starting off with major engagements on the old battlefields of Katif and Abu Aguila, General Ariel Sharon's division smashed open the center of the Egyptian line. Meanwhile, Tal's division bypassed the frontal defenses along the Gaza Strip and cut them off from the Egyptian Sinai by striking through Rafah and Khan Yunis. Here, Palestinian Liberation Army, or PLA, militia and Egyptian ground forces were unable to stop the Israeli advance. Also, a third Israeli division under General Yofi struck between these two axes of advance, interdicting Egyptian reinforcements at places like Bir Lafan and Jebel Libni. For wargaming on accurate Sinai terrain, the battlefield offers a variety of choices. The north is classic sandy desert, with coastal roads and rail lines, not unlike El Alamein of World War II fame. The center of the Sinai is rugged and rocky, where roads and passes are much more vital. The south is very mountainous and should be all but impassable to mechanized armies of 1967. One thing wargamers should definitely leave out is, believe it or not, the Israeli Air Force, at least on that critical first day when the vast majority of the important, intense battles actually took place on the ground. Please remember that the IAF was busy during these hours, smashing Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces and command infrastructure. IAF battlefield tactical strikes don't begin until sunrise on June 6th, the second day of the war. The Egyptian army, despite a number of bitterly fought defensive stands on the first 2 days of the war, quickly fell apart after that. Generals had documented at medical nervous breakdowns. General Nasser went into virtual hiding and hysterics. A general retreat was ordered, but without any organization or plan. 100,000 Egyptian troops and thousands of vehicles simply turned around and fled for their lives. It was virtually every man for himself, strung out along a handful of Sinai roads still open, where they were murderously exposed to the Israeli Air Force, who had an absolute field day. Thousands of Egyptian troops that abandoned the roads instead died of thirst in the Sinai desert. With the Egyptian army disintegrating in the Sinai, Israel turned next on Jordan. Still largely paralyzed by Israeli airstrikes, the Royal Jordanian Army fought a series of losing tank and mechanized battles against Palad's division across the West Bank. Ramallah, Bethlehem, and Jericho all saw action, but the biggest battle was in the north at Jenin, where Jordanian Patton tanks fought against Israeli Shot Centurions. Jordanian Centurions largely never made it into combat, instead smashed by the Israeli Air Force, which still ruled the skies with French-built Mystère and Mirage 3 fighter bombers. Meanwhile, Israeli tanks and paratroopers were engaged in the streets of Jerusalem itself, a divided city since the 1949 ceasefire that had ended Israel's War of Independence. Soon they'd taken all of Jerusalem, including the famous Western Wall. This ancient wall holds immense symbolic importance to the Jewish people, the last remaining fragment of the Second Temple destroyed by Imperial Romans in 70 AD. In the last 2 days of the war, Israel turned finally on Syria, determined to clear the Golan Heights, which is a volcanic shelf of high ground at the foot of Mount Hebron, which had long served as a base for Syrian artillery, rocket, and terrorist raids into Israeli Galilee. Until now, the Golan Front had actually been pretty quiet. Syria had tried to make a show of being involved in the war without becoming too heavily engaged. After the IAF had wiped out their air force, the Syrians shelled some Israeli positions, but while the Egyptians and Jordanians were heavily engaged and defeated, the Syrians largely did nothing. With most IDF units already engaged in the Sinai and the West Bank, the Golan Heights was initially attacked only by a single brigade of elite Israeli infantry and another brigade of tanks. Although small, some of the infantry battles here were incredibly intense and bloody. Later, some of Palad's armored division joined the battle from the south, clearing the Golan before a United Nations ceasefire took effect at about 1830 hours on June 10th. For Wargaming the 6-Day War, players have plenty of options. Operational level games are too numerous to count, but some recommendations include 6 Days of War by High Flying Dice Games. This game is by Paul Rohrbaugh, the same designer using the same basic system as we saw with Operation Kadesh in our last episode. For command tactical or unit scale tactical games, at the risk of sounding repetitive, my first choice is always going to be Avalon Hill's The Arab-Israeli Wars. While the base set for this game only had 2 scenarios for the 1956 war, many more are presented for the 1967 war, including Sharon's division against Egyptian 2nd Infantry at Abu Aguila, and Tal's division against Egyptian 7th Infantry, and 20th PLA division at Khan Yunis. Another classic is Jenin, where we see Jordanian forces in fortified defense against Israeli tanks and mechanized infantry on the West Bank north of Jerusalem. Now, this wargame scenario isn't perfect. It portrays Israeli 20-pounder Centurions instead of the M48s that were actually there. But game designers were limited at the time by what counters they could physically include on the punch sheets. This is an older game, but the system is almost unmatched at capturing the real scales, geometries, and dynamics of how regiment and brigade scale combat actually works in the time period. Honorable mention also goes to Avalanche Press's Sword of Israel, a 1967 expansion for their great Panzer Grenadier game system. This is at a similar scale as the Arab-Israeli Wars, where each piece on the board represents a platoon of 5 tanks or about 40 men. But this game presents about 50 scenarios, all of them for the 1967 war. The counters and map sheets are gorgeous, and the historical research is seriously some of the best I've seen in any wargame. Now, you guys probably know how I feel about historical fidelity in my wargames, so when I give the game 5 stars in this category, you know that they've really done well in this area. For miniature wargames, one possibility is GHQ Micro Armor, usually played at the 1 to 285th scale, or roughly 6mm. Again, the game is unit scaled at the platoon level, and the small scale allows for a more realistic look at the reach of 1960s mechanized combat. For WYSIWYG scale wargaming, we recommend Battlefront's new Fate of a Nation release. Specifically, the new book presented as part of the Team Yankee system. Focusing on the 1967 and 1973 wars, the system does a great job in representing certain key 1967 battlefield features, such as heat ammunition, that's an acronym for high explosive anti-tank, the slow rate of fire for Soviet-designed tanks, this is because of how the guns were often mounted in the turrets, and also infrared sights. This is actually a critical Egyptian advantage at certain night battles like Bir Lafan. One thing that might be a little sketchy is clear delineation on when certain units are eligible for use. Remember, this book covers 2 wars, and a lot changes between 1967 and 1973. So please note that not everything in the Fate of a Nation book should be used in a historically accurate 1967 scenario. Now, oftentimes the book does do a great job of making this clear in the notes that accompany certain units. Just please pay close attention to these notes to help ensure that your 1967 game doesn't drift too far into 1973 territory. For this episode's Q&A section, we had some great feedback on last episode's look at the 1956 Sinai War. LSR 2590 from On Tabletop asks, was Israel concerned about an attack from Syria or any of their other neighbors in that area? Having a lot of the Israeli military in one area must have made for a tempting target. Okay, this is actually a really great question. In 1956, when it comes to Jordan, yes, the Israelis were definitely worried about a potential second front opening up while they were occupied against the Egyptians with Operation Kadesh in the Sinai. This is why they struck the Jordanians first, in a series of small actions, including a tank and paratrooper raid on the Jordanian police fort at Qalqilia. not only to keep the Jordanians on the back foot, but also to disguise the intended direction for the buildup of Kadesh. The Syrians, meanwhile, didn't really present a formal threat in 1956, more for political rather than military reasons. While artillery and paramilitary activity was a factor on the Golan, the Syrians and Egyptians weren't really in close agreement or cooperation at this time, and Nasser wasn't having much luck yet in getting Syria to help him with military action against Israel. Now, of course, this would certainly change in later decades, but in 1956 it wasn't really a big deal yet. Damon from On Tabletop asks, do you think the 1967 assault through mostly the same areas was easier or harder for the Israelis? Again, another great question. And while there is definitely a case to be made for familiarity with the battlefield, when you're attacking over the same battlefield, you've been there before, you know where all the blind angles are, etc. Nevertheless, the 1967 assaults were definitely harder for the Israelis, particularly in the Sinai. Egyptian 2nd Infantry Division defended the exact same battlefields at Qusayma, Katif, and Abu Aguila against Sharon's division in 1967. Not only did the Egyptians have a hell of a lot more firepower, and were much more deeply entrenched behind thicker minefields, but they'd also much more carefully mapped out the desert, and no longer considered the gaps through which the Israelis had struck in 1956 as impassable. Long story short, there were no more surprise routes for the Israelis to use. Further north in Rafah and Khan Yunis, the Egyptian 7th Infantry was much more securely dug in than the Egyptians had been in 56, with heavy tanks in support including Stalin 3s. They also had the fully militarized 20th PLA Division in place, with dozens of dug-in T-34-85s. This is definitely a tough nut to crack for Tal's division. Remember everyone, if you have any questions about today's episode, just drop it in the comments below and maybe we'll get to it in a future episode. Come back next time when we take a look at the next Arab-Israeli conflict, the Yom Kippur War of 1973. This is a big one, folks, and this is the one that I've been looking forward to. Meanwhile, you can follow us on Facebook, on Tabletop, and Podbean, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or support us on Patreon. So that's going to wrap us up for today, everyone. This is Oriskany, and Tango Mike for listening.